What's up? Welcome to Updates with Mr. Warford. This is for AP Human Geography. We're moving on to Unit 4, Political Patterns and Processes. So when we think back on what we've been talking about so far this year, we have touched on political boundaries, political maps, formal regions, but how did we end up with all this? Okay, political geography is just the study of the patterns and methods that humans have used over time to organize their claims to portions of the Earth's surface. Here's a few questions that we're going to be answering throughout the political geography unit, and we're going to look back on those later. The essential question we're going to talk about in the next few days is going to be what social, historical, and economic factors have influenced modern political maps at various scales. So we have to understand, and a lot of this you're going to be covering in world history next year, but we have to understand that for a couple thousand years, basically most of the world was broken up into like these large empires or kingdoms. Okay, they were ruled by kings, queens, czars, emperors, things like that. But over time, we saw that things like wars between different empires and kingdoms, revolutions, civil war, different ideas about political power, economics, this idea of individual freedom, really shifted around the world map, especially in the past 400 years. And what we find is that now the building blocks, you could call them, of the world political map are what's called states. And when I say state in AP Human Geography, we're not referring to like Kentucky, Tennessee, Arizona, Wisconsin. We're talking about countries. Okay, so the AP Human Geo definition of a state, it's the largest political unit when you're describing political boundaries, okay? It's the formal term for a country. And it must meet 4 different criteria: a defined geographic boundary, a permanent population, it maintains its sovereignty over other states around it, and meaning freedom, and it's recognized by other states as being legitimate. Another categorization of different political entity is a nation. Okay, a nation is a group of people that shares a common culture. Okay, they have beliefs and values that unify them, and they claim a particular space as their traditional homeland, and sometimes they may have sovereignty over their own geographic area or their own land, and sometimes they don't. And we're going to talk about that more as the unit goes on. So a nation state is, you guessed it, a combination of those two. It's a singular nation of people, so they have this shared common core of culture, and they fulfill the qualifications of a state. 2 great examples of that would be Iceland and Japan, because they are, sovereign countries, but they also have a large population of people that are culturally homogeneous or the same. So here's some other examples of nations, states, and nation states, okay? And very important that we don't mix all those together and refer to them as the same thing, because they are actually different. And we're going to continue drilling this, practicing this throughout Unit 4. Now we're going to get into some more specific examples of political entities. The next one is multinational states. This is where a country contains more than one nation. Remember, a nation is a group of culturally similar people. All right, so this is where a state has multiple nations within it. So examples of that would be Canada, because Canada has a large French-speaking population in an area known as Quebec, and they also have an Inuit, which is an indigenous people group in Canada. They have an Inuit population as well, so they are a multinational state. Also, the former Soviet Union is a great example of a multinational state, because they had several countries that existed within it that had a unique culture, but it was under one government called the Soviet Union, or USSR. And that is a great example of a multinational state, even though it doesn't exist anymore. Here's some other types of political entities: an autonomous region. So sometimes there's an area within a state that gets a high degree of self-government and freedom from its parent state, usually because of geographic, ethnic, or cultural reasons. Okay, here's a great example: a place called Åland between Finland and Sweden. It's an area that has most residents speaking Swedish, considering themselves Swedish. But after World War I, Åland asked this governing body of the world called the League of Nations to join Sweden, but the League of Nations ruled that they would have to be what's considered a non-militarized, largely self-governing entity that actually belongs to Finland. So Åland is an example of an autonomous region because they're given a lot of freedom within this little island to kind of do their own thing, but technically they are property of Finland. And next up, a stateless nation. Okay, a stateless nation is a cultural group that has no independent political entity, okay, or identity. They don't have a state of their own. They don't have a government. They don't have recognized boundaries, but they are very unique in their cultural identity. So they consider themselves part of that nation, but they don't fulfill the requirements of being a state. So great examples of that, some of which we've already talked about this year, are Palestine. Remember, they are not technically their own country, but people identify as Palestinian. The Basque people between Spain and France, and then the Kurds, or the Kurdish people, that we're going to talk about later in this unit, that live in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran, and Armenia. The tricky part for the AP exam, okay, is that there's a lot of debate over how you can define different countries. Is it just a state? Is it just a nation? Is it a nation state? Is it a multinational state? Is it a stateless nation? Whatever it is. So if you're going to use a country, if you're going to name drop a country as an example in an FRQ, or if it just straight up asks you in an FRQ about how to categorize a certain place, stick to examples from the textbook, okay? Because if you just Google things and then take that as fact, you may end up getting some stuff wrong on the AP exam. So stick to textbook examples or examples from class, okay? So what is the U.S. then after all this? Or is it because, you know, when we do the Pledge of Allegiance and we say one nation under God, indivisible, are we a nation? Are we a nation state? What are we? For the purposes of AP Human Geography, I would refer to the United States as simply just a state, okay? That's, you know, the broadest term for country is a state. Stick to the word state for AP Human Geography. Reason being, the United States, calling the United States a nation is kind of tricky because a nation has unified characteristics. And if you look at the United States, we are not necessarily a homogeneous culture. Very different religions, races, ethnicities, beliefs, even within like a few thousand miles of each other. And it's a very large country with lots of different ideas about culture. Some would argue that our ideas of freedom, democracy, individualism bind us together. Also the fact that a lot of people in America speak English. But a lot of people would argue that that's not enough to be considered a nation or a nation state. Okay, so play it safe. If you're going to talk about the United States on an FRQ that refers to political geography, just call it a state. Because we have defined boundaries, a permanent population, sovereignty, and we're recognized by other states or other countries. So make sure that we know this new vocabulary, and we're going to drill and practice it throughout Unit 4. You'll know it by the back of your hand by the time the Unit 4 exam comes around. So keep looking over it, work on your vocab key questions as well. Have a great day.